James had always dreamed of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life. After years of working tirelessly as an engineer in a crowded urban environment, he finally made the leap. Nestled deep in the mountains, his newly purchased property was the epitome of peace. Towering evergreens lined the edges of his land, and a babbling creek added a soothing soundtrack to his day. His cabin, modest yet cozy, ran on a mix of solar panels and grid electricity, a setup that was more than enough for his minimalist lifestyle. For the first few months, James reveled in his newfound solitude. He spent his mornings hiking trails that wove through the nearby woods, afternoons working on small projects in his workshop, and evenings stargazing from his porch. The cabin's utilities had been well designed by its previous owner, with energy-efficient systems keeping his bills low. James took pride in monitoring his energy usage, finding a certain joy in seeing how little he needed to live comfortably. Life was idyllic, until the day he opened his latest electric bill. Sipping his coffee at the kitchen table, James unfolded the bill and nearly choked. The numbers didn't make sense. His usage had more than tripled since the previous month. At first, he thought it might be a clerical error. He double-checked the bill against his records and the meter readings he'd started taking when he moved in. The numbers matched. Somewhere, somehow, an enormous amount of electricity was being drained from his account. His initial reaction was to suspect a malfunction. Maybe the solar panels weren't syncing correctly with the grid, or there was an issue with the inverter. He spent the better part of a day meticulously inspecting every part of the system. The panels were clean and intact, the inverter was functioning perfectly, and there were no signs of overuse in the cabin. He checked his appliances one by one: refrigerator, heater, water pump, all operated within their usual parameters. It was a mystery. The thought of an external issue didn't immediately occur to him. His property was remote, the kind of place where neighbors were sparse and everyone minded their own business. His nearest neighbor, Karen, lived a good half-mile down the valley. They had met briefly when James first moved in. Karen had introduced herself as the unofficial mayor of the area, a title she seemed to have given herself. That she had an air of entitlement and an overbearing personality, but James had chalked it up to small-town quirks and hadn't thought much of it since. But as the days passed, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He started noticing little signs around his property, footprints near the edge of the driveway that didn't match his boots, an empty soda can left near the utility box, and faint tire tracks on the dirt road leading to his cabin. These might have been coincidences, but James had lived long enough to know that coincidences rarely stayed that way. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, James decided to install a motion-activated camera near the utility box, which housed the main electrical connection to his property. He bought a high-quality camera that could record in full HD and had night vision capabilities, ensuring nothing would escape its lens. He mounted it discreetly, hidden among the branches of a nearby pine tree, and angled it to capture anyone who approached the box. Satisfied with his setup, James felt a renewed sense of control. Whatever was happening, he would soon have answers. The next morning, he retrieved the footage and sat down with his laptop to review it. The first few hours showed nothing but the usual sights: swaying trees, a deer wandering through the clearing, and the occasional squirrel darting past. But as the recording approached midnight, James froze. There, illuminated by the faint glow of a flashlight, was a figure creeping toward his utility box. The person moved quickly, almost frantically, dragging what appeared to be an extension cord. James squinted at the screen, his heart pounding as he recognized the intruder. It was Karen. She was dressed in dark clothing and wore a headlamp that bobbed as she worked. The video showed her prying open the utility box with a screwdriver and plugging in the extension cord. Once connected, she hurriedly coiled the rest of the cord and disappeared down the road, the cord trailing behind her. James watched the footage twice, unable to believe what he was seeing. His neighbor, the self-proclaimed mayor of the valley, was stealing his electricity. The realization ignited a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a touch of amusement at the audacity of it all. Who did something like this, and why? Karen's home wasn't far enough to justify such an elaborate setup unless she was powering something substantial. James thought back to their brief encounter and remembered her mentioning her love of holiday decoration. James decided to confront her. He copied the footage onto his phone and made his way down the road to Karen's property. As he approached her house, his suspicions were confirmed. The place was a beacon of light, covered in strings of blinking Christmas lights, inflatable decorations, and a massive illuminated reindeer on the roof. It was so over the top that James wondered how he hadn't noticed it sooner. Karen was in her front yard, adjusting a string of lights on a bush. She looked up as James approached, her expression shifting from surprise to defensiveness as she saw the stern look on his face. "Karen," James began, trying to keep his voice steady, "we need to talk." "Oh, hi, James," she said, her tone overly cheerful. "What brings you down here? Isn't my display just fabulous? It really brings some holiday cheer to the valley, don't you think?" "It's impressive," James admitted, "but that's not why I'm here. I have a question about my electric bill." Karen's smile faltered. "Your electric bill? What does that have to do with me?" "I have footage of someone hooking an extension cord to my utility box," James said, pulling out his phone. "Care to explain?" Her face turned red, but she quickly recovered, putting on an air of indignation. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm not accusing you. I'm stating a fact," James replied, holding up the phone to show her the footage. Karen's expression hardened as she watched the screen. When the video ended, she crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You can't just spy on people like that. It's an invasion of privacy." "You're on my property," James said firmly. "That's not privacy, that's trespassing and theft." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned on her heel and stomped toward her house. "If you want to play dirty, James, two can play that game," she called over her shoulder. "Don't think for a second I'll let you harass me like this." James watched her go, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. James couldn't sleep that night. The confrontation with Karen replayed in his mind over and over again. Her audacity, her complete denial despite the clear evidence. How could someone behave like that? He stared at the ceiling of his cabin, the faint hum of the heater the only sound in the otherwise silent mountain night. Every time he closed his eyes, Karen's smug expression flashed before him. He needed to do something. But what? By morning, James had decided on his next steps. If Karen thought she could dismiss him so easily, she was wrong. He wouldn't let her steal from him without consequences. After all, it wasn't just the money, though the spike in his electric bill was annoying. It was the principle of the matter. This was his property and she had violated it. He had worked hard to create this peaceful retreat for himself, and he wasn't about to let someone like Karen disrupt it. His first move was to secure the utility box. Though Karen had used a screwdriver to pry it open, James knew she wouldn't stop there. She seemed like the kind of person who would double down if challenged. He drove into town and picked up a heavy-duty padlock and a steel cover plate designed to make tampering with the box nearly impossible. He also bought a set of motion-activated lights and another camera to cover the driveway leading up to the cabin. If Karen tried to sneak onto his property again, she wouldn't go unnoticed. Back at the cabin, James spent the afternoon installing the new security measures. The padlock clicked into place with a satisfying finality, and the steel cover gave him peace of mind. The lights were positioned strategically to flood the area with brightness if anyone approached, and the new camera was hidden high in a tree, its lens trained on the driveway. By the time he finished, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest. Feeling a bit more secure, James decided to check his property for any other signs of tampering. He walked the perimeter of his land looking for disturbances. Near the edge of the clearing where his cabin sat, he found something troubling: Karen's tire tracks. They weren't new, but they weren't old either. It was clear she'd driven up to his cabin more than once. He followed the tracks as they meandered back toward the main road, noting how they veered off course in some places, as if she'd been in a hurry. The discovery unsettled him. How long had this been going on? And how much had she taken before he noticed the spike in his bill? The questions gnawed at him, but he tried to push them aside. With the new security measures in place, she wouldn't be able to get away with it again. Or so he thought. The next morning, James decided to check the footage from his cameras. He didn't expect to find anything. After all, Karen had seemed flustered enough during their confrontation that he assumed she wouldn't try anything so soon. But as he scrolled through the night's recordings, his heart sank. There she was, once again. The footage showed her creeping onto his property just after midnight, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She approached the utility box, but when she saw the new lock and cover, she froze. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the box as if trying to figure out her next move. Then, to James's disbelief, she pulled out a hammer from her bag and began striking the lock. The motion-activated lights burst to life, illuminating the entire area. Karen stumbled backward, shielding her eyes, but she quickly recovered and ran off into the woods, leaving her hammer behind. James sat back in his chair, his fists clenched. She wasn't just a nuisance. She was bold, reckless, and completely unbothered by the idea of getting caught. Determined not to let her actions go unpunished, James decided it was time to involve the authorities. He gathered all the evidence he had, the footage of her tampering with the utility box, the photos of her tire tracks, and the hammer she had left behind. He drove into town to file a police report, explaining the situation in detail to the officer on duty. The officer, a middle-aged man named Deputy Carter, listened attentively, his brow furrowing as James recounted the events. "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Karen," Deputy Carter said, jotting down notes. "She's known for causing trouble in the area, but this is a new low. Stealing electricity is a serious offense." James felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone was taking him seriously. The deputy assured him that they would look into the matter and pay Karen a visit. "In the meantime," Carter added, "keep your cameras rolling. If she comes back, we'll have even more evidence to use against her." That evening, James felt a glimmer of hope. Surely a visit from the police would be enough to scare Karen into stopping. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Karen didn't strike him as the type to back down easily. His suspicions were confirmed the next day when he heard the sound of a car pulling up to his cabin. Looking out the window, he saw Karen stepping out of her SUV, her expression a mix of anger and smugness. She marched up to his porch and pounded on the door. James opened it, keeping the screen door closed between them. "What do you want, Karen?" he asked, his tone cold. "I want to know why you're harassing me with the police," she snapped. "You had no right to file that report. I didn't do anything wrong." James crossed his arms. "You've been stealing electricity from my property. I have the footage to prove it." Karen scoffed. "That footage doesn't mean anything. You can't prove it was me." "Your hammer was left at the scene," James shot back, "and your tire tracks lead straight from your house to mine." For a moment, Karen looked rattled, but she quickly recovered. "This is harassment," she said, her voice rising. "I could sue you for this, you know. You're trying to ruin my reputation." "Karen," James said, his patience wearing thin, "you ruined your own reputation when you started stealing from me. Now get off my property before I call the cops again." Karen glared at him, her face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this," she hissed, before turning on her heel and stomping back to her car. She slammed the door shut and sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust as she went. James watched her go, his heart pounding. He had no idea what she meant by "you'll regret this," but he didn't doubt for a second that she meant it. As he stood on his porch, the weight of the situation settled on him. Karen wasn't going to stop, and he needed to be ready for whatever came next. That night, James double-checked all his security measures and reviewed the footage from his cameras one more time, just in case he had missed anything. He felt like a soldier preparing for battle, knowing that the fight was far from over. As he lay in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, he resolved to stand his ground. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he wouldn't let anyone take that away from him. Especially not Karen. James woke up the next morning with an uneasy feeling in his chest. The confrontation with Karen the previous day had left him on edge. Her parting words, "You'll regret this," echoed in his mind like a threat he couldn't quite shake off. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she said them, dripping with venom and wrapped in that smug sense of entitlement she seemed to wear like armor. He sipped his coffee on the porch, scanning the tree line that bordered his property. The fresh mountain air, usually calming, did little to soothe him today. Karen wasn't just a problem, she was a storm brewing on the horizon, and James knew he needed to prepare for whatever chaos she planned to unleash. Around midday, the first signs of her retaliation appeared. James heard a distant rumble and the crunch of tires on gravel. Looking out his kitchen window, he saw a white truck pulling up to the edge of his property. It was towing a flatbed trailer filled with wooden stakes, rolls of barbed wire, and a stack of bright orange "No Trespassing" signs. Karen stepped out of her SUV a moment later, a clipboard in hand, directing the workers like a general commanding her troops. James watched in disbelief as the crew began unloading the materials. They hammered stakes into the ground, running the barbed wire along the edges of what Karen was now declaring as her property. The orange signs went up next, each one emblazoned with bold letters warning anyone against setting foot on what she claimed was private land. James stormed outside, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the scene. "Karen, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the clatter of hammers and the hum of an engine. Karen turned to him, her face lit with a smug smile. "I'm reclaiming what's mine," she said, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "This land has been in dispute for years." "You didn't think you could just waltz in and take it, did you?" "Dispute?" James repeated, incredulous. "This land is mine. I have the deed, the survey reports, everything. You're trespassing, Karen, and you know it." Karen's smile widened as if she relished his frustration. "Oh, I've got paperwork too," she said, tapping her clipboard. "Maybe you should check your facts before accusing me of anything. This is all perfectly legal." James's blood boiled. "I'm calling the police," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "You can explain your perfectly legal actions to them." Karen's face darkened for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her smug expression returning. "Go ahead," she said, shrugging, "but I'd hate for this to escalate into something messy, wouldn't you?" James ignored her veiled threat and stepped away to make the call. The dispatcher assured him that an officer would be sent to investigate, but it would take time. Being in a remote area meant that law enforcement wasn't exactly prompt. Frustrated but determined, James returned to his cabin, deciding to let the police handle the situation. While he waited, he reviewed his property's documents, scanning the survey maps and legal descriptions to confirm what he already knew. There was no ambiguity. The land Karen was fencing off was well within the boundaries of his property. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, malicious harassment. The police finally arrived later that afternoon. Deputy Carter stepped out of his cruiser, his expression grim as he took in the scene. James quickly brought him up to speed, showing him the deed and the survey maps. Karen, meanwhile, put on an exaggerated air of innocence, presenting her own documentation and claiming that the land had always been hers. Carter took his time examining both sets of papers, his brow furrowing as he compared the documents. "Ms. Karen," he said finally, his tone firm, "these papers you've provided don't hold up. This land isn't yours, and you have no legal right to be here." Karen's face turned red, but she didn't back down. "I don't care what those papers say," she snapped. "This is my family's land. He's the trespasser." Carter sighed, clearly tired of dealing with her. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to remove this fencing and leave the property. If you refuse, you could face charges for trespassing and vandalism." Karen's expression twisted with rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed, pointing a finger at both Carter and James. "You're all against me. You'll see." Despite the warning, Karen reluctantly ordered her crew to pack up. The workers dismantled the fencing and loaded everything back onto the truck, all while Karen muttered under her breath about injustices and corrupt systems. James stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as they drove off, the tension in his shoulders only slightly easing. Deputy Carter turned to him. "Keep an eye out," he said. "People like her don't tend to let things go. If she tries anything else, call us right away." "Will do," James replied, though he knew it was more a matter of when Karen would strike again, not if. That evening, James double-checked his security cameras, repositioning them to cover more angles. He installed additional motion-activated lights around the cabin and reinforced the locks on his doors and windows. If Karen wanted a fight, she'd find him ready. But as the days passed, the tension only grew. Karen had gone quiet, too quiet. James kept a watchful eye on his property, half expecting to see her lurking in the shadows, yet there were no signs of her, no tire tracks, no disturbances. It was almost as if she had vanished. Then, one night, the quiet shattered. James was jolted awake by the blaring alarm of his motion sensors. He jumped out of bed, grabbed his flashlight, and hurried to the window. The lights outside were blazing, illuminating a chaotic scene. His generator, which was housed in a small shed near the utility box, was engulfed in flames. The fire crackled and roared, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. James's heart raced as he grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran outside. The heat was intense, the flames licking at the edges of the shed. He fought to douse the fire, his mind racing with questions. Who had done this? Was it Karen? And if so, how far was she willing to go? As he extinguished the last of the flames, James's eyes caught something on the ground near the shed. A canister of lighter fluid. His hands trembled as he picked it up, the reality sinking in. This wasn't an accident. Someone, likely Karen, had tried to destroy his property. The next morning, James called Deputy Carter again, showing him the burned shed and the canister of lighter fluid. Carter's expression was grim as he examined the scene. "This is arson," he said. "And if Karen's behind it, she's just escalated to a whole new level." James nodded, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let her get away with this. Whatever it took, he would protect his home and hold her accountable. The battle with Karen was far from over, but James was ready for whatever came next. James sat on his porch, staring at the charred remains of his generator shed as the morning sun filtered through the pine trees. The scent of burnt wood lingered in the air, a stark reminder of the previous night's chaos. His hands rested on his lap, clenched into fists. The frustration and anger simmering inside him were almost unbearable. Karen had crossed a line. Again. The evidence was damning, and he had no doubt she was behind the fire, but James also knew that proving it in court would be a battle in itself. Deputy Carter had left shortly after taking photographs of the scene and collecting the canister of lighter fluid for evidence. He'd promised to open an investigation and look into Karen's possible involvement, but James knew how slow the wheels of justice could turn. In the meantime, he was left to deal with the aftermath. The generator shed had been a crucial part of his setup, providing backup power during the colder months when solar alone wasn't enough. With winter fast approaching, the loss was devastating. Determined to keep moving forward, James spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess. He pulled the remains of the generator from the wreckage, noting how the heat had warped its metal frame. It was beyond repair. As he worked, a thought crept into his mind. What if Karen wasn't finished? The fire was already an escalation. What if she decided to take things even further? The idea unsettled him, and he resolved to be even more vigilant. By the time he finished clearing the debris, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Exhausted, James returned to his cabin and double-checked his security measures. The cameras were still operational, and the motion-activated lights remained his first line of defense. He had even gone so far as to install a secondary lock on the utility box to prevent tampering. Yet, despite all his precautions, a sense of unease lingered. That night, James lay awake in bed, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He hated feeling this way, like a prisoner in his own home. The peaceful retreat he had worked so hard to create was now a battleground, and Karen was the enemy lurking in the shadows. Around midnight, James finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake hours later by the piercing sound of his alarm system. He bolted upright, his heart racing as adrenaline surged through his veins. The motion sensors had been triggered again. Without hesitation, he grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and peered out the window. The floodlights illuminated the clearing, but he saw nothing unusual. The cameras, however, would tell him a different story. James hurried to his laptop and pulled up the live feed from his security system. His stomach dropped as he watched the footage. Karen was back. The cameras showed her sneaking through the woods at the edge of his property, holding what looked like a crowbar. She was wearing dark clothing and moved cautiously, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. It was clear she was trying to avoid detection, but the cameras had caught everything. James clenched his jaw, his anger boiling over. This wasn't just petty theft or a misguided attempt at revenge. This was malicious harassment. Karen wasn't just crossing boundaries. She was waging a war. He knew he couldn't let her get away with it this time. He grabbed his phone and dialed Deputy Carter's number, explaining the situation as quickly as he could. "She's on your property right now?" Carter asked, his voice sharp with urgency. "Yes," James replied. "The cameras caught her sneaking in. I think she's trying to vandalize something." "I'm on my way," Carter said. "Stay inside and keep the feed running. Don't confront her directly." James hung up and returned to the laptop, watching as Karen made her way closer to the cabin. She stopped near the remains of the generator shed, crouching down and inspecting the area. James couldn't tell what she was doing, but the sight of her trespassing so brazenly sent a surge of fury through him. Minutes felt like hours as James waited for Carter to arrive. He kept one eye on the camera feed and the other on the window, scanning the driveway for any sign of the deputy's cruiser. Finally, the sound of approaching sirens broke the tense silence. Karen, startled by the noise, froze in place before bolting back toward the woods. James watched as she disappeared into the trees, her crowbar glinting briefly in the light before she vanished. Carter's cruiser pulled up moments later, and the deputy stepped out, flashlight in hand. James rushed outside to meet him, pointing toward the woods where Karen had fled. "She ran that way," James said, his breath coming in short bursts. "She was near the generator shed when the sirens scared her off." Carter nodded, his expression grim. "Let's see what we can find." The two men walked to the shed, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Carter inspected the area where Karen had been crouching and found fresh marks in the dirt as if she had been digging or prying at something. Nearby, they discovered a small plastic bag partially buried in the ground. Carter pulled it out carefully, holding it up to the light. Inside were several scraps of burned paper, along with what appeared to be a charred photo. "What the hell is this?" James muttered, leaning in for a closer look. Carter frowned. "Looks like she was trying to plant evidence or destroy something incriminating. Either way, it's suspicious." They bagged the items for further analysis and continued searching the area, but Karen was long gone. Carter promised to review the security footage and follow up on the new evidence. Before leaving, he advised James to remain vigilant and document everything. The next day, James found himself in town, meeting with a lawyer. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop until she was forced to, and James needed to protect himself legally. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Clara, listened carefully as James recounted the events of the past few weeks. She assured him that he had a strong case for harassment and trespassing and promised to help him file for a restraining order against Karen. "You've done everything right so far," Clara said, flipping through the stack of evidence James had brought. "The footage, the police reports, the physical evidence, it all paints a clear picture. Karen's behavior is escalating, and a restraining order will send a message that this won't be tolerated." James left the office feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a plan, a way to fight back against Karen's relentless harassment. But as he drove back to the cabin, a nagging thought crept into his mind. What if a restraining order wasn't enough? What if Karen ignored it, just as she had ignored the police warnings? That evening, James fortified his cabin even further, adding extra locks to the doors and setting up an additional layer of motion sensors around the perimeter. He knew it was only a matter of time before Karen struck again, but this time, he would be ready. As the sun set and the forest grew quiet, James sat on his porch, watching the tree line with a wary eye. The battle with Karen wasn't over, but he was determined to win. She had underestimated him, thinking she could bully and intimidate him into submission. But James wasn't the type to back down. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he would fight to protect it, no matter what. The days following Karen's midnight intrusion were tense but uneventful. James had taken every precaution he could think of. His cameras were now recording continuously, capturing every angle of his property. Motion sensors surrounded his cabin like an invisible shield, and additional locks fortified every door and window. Even his closest friends from his old life in the city, who called to check on him, joked that he was turning his mountain retreat into a fortress. But James wasn't laughing. He was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, and physically. His sanctuary, the peaceful escape he had worked so hard to create, was now a constant source of stress. He spent every day watching the footage, scanning for any sign of Karen. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the trees made his heart race. He knew she wasn't done. Karen was the type of person who thrived on control, and the restraining order he'd filed with his lawyer's help was nothing more than a piece of paper to someone like her. The restraining order was served a week after Karen's last stunt. Deputy Carter personally delivered it to her doorstep, a measure James had requested to ensure it wasn't conveniently lost in the mail. Karen's reaction was predictable. According to Carter, she had ranted about her rights, called James a liar, and vowed to see him in court. But beneath her bluster, James could sense her desperation. She was cornered now, and that made her even more dangerous. The calm before the storm finally ended one cold, moonlit night. James had just settled into bed, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the occasional groan of the cabin's wooden frame reminded him how isolated he was. He was drifting into a restless sleep when the piercing wail of the motion sensor alarm jolted him awake. His heart thundered in his chest as he jumped out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat from its usual spot. This time, he didn't bother with the laptop feed. He knew Karen was back. Pulling on his boots and jacket, he stepped outside into the cold night air, his breath visible in the faint glow of the floodlights. The clearing was bathed in a harsh, artificial light, but at first glance, everything seemed normal. Then he saw her. Karen was at the edge of the property, near the utility box, her figure partially obscured by the shadows of the tree line. She was holding something large and bulky, a can of spray paint. As James moved closer, he realized she was defacing the utility box, scrawling words across it in bright red letters. His blood boiled as he read the slurs she had written: thief, liar, cheat. Karen, so consumed by her task, hadn't noticed him yet. "Karen!" James shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. She froze, the spray can slipping from her hand and hitting the ground with a metallic clatter. Slowly, she turned to face him, her face a mask of anger and defiance. "You think you've won?" she hissed, her voice shaking. "You think you can take everything from me and get away with it?" James tightened his grip on the bat, but he stayed where he was. "This is my property, Karen. You've been told to stay away. Do you have any idea how far you've gone? The restraining order, the police warnings? None of it matters to you, does it?" Karen stepped forward, her hands balled into fists. "None of this is yours," she screamed. "This land should have been mine. You're nothing but a thief." James shook his head, a mix of pity and frustration washing over him. "This isn't about the land, is it? This is about control. You can't stand that you've lost." Karen's eyes blazed with fury. "I'll show you who's lost," she spat, lunging toward him. James stepped back, his heart pounding. He didn't want to hurt her, but he wasn't about to let her hurt him either. "Stop!" he commanded, his voice firm. "You're making this worse for yourself." Before Karen could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. James felt a surge of relief as he saw the familiar flash of blue and red lights cutting through the darkness. Deputy Carter had come through again. Responding to the alert James had set up to notify the police automatically if the sensors were triggered while the restraining order was active. Karen froze, her bravado crumbling as the reality of her situation sank in. The police cruiser pulled up and Carter stepped out, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "Karen, step away from him," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Karen hesitated, her gaze darting between James and Carter. For a moment, it looked like she might try to run, but she finally raised her hands in defeat. Carter approached her cautiously, handcuffing her as he recited her rights. Karen didn't resist, but the venom in her glare was unmistakable. As Carter led her toward the cruiser, she turned back to James. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and menacing. "You'll regret this." James didn't respond. He stood there in the cold, watching as Carter loaded Karen into the back of the cruiser and drove off into the night. The floodlights cast long shadows across the clearing, and for the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of finality. The days that followed were a whirlwind of police reports, legal proceedings, and repairs. Karen was charged with multiple offenses, including trespassing, vandalism, arson, and violation of the restraining order. Her history of similar behavior with other neighbors only strengthened the case against her, and it wasn't long before she faced serious legal consequences. James, with the help of his lawyer Clara, filed a civil suit to recover the costs of the damages she had caused. Though it would take time, he was confident he would see justice served. With Karen out of the picture, the peace James had sought when he moved to the mountains slowly returned. He rebuilt the generator shed, repainted the utility box, and removed every trace of Karen's intrusion. The scars she had left, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal, but James knew he had done everything he could to protect what was his. One crisp morning, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, James reflected on everything that had happened. The ordeal with Karen had tested him in ways he never expected, forcing him to stand his ground and fight for his peace. It wasn't the life he had envisioned when he moved to the mountains, but in a way, it had made him stronger. He had reclaimed his sanctuary, and no one, not even someone as vindictive as Karen, could take that away from him. As the sun rose over the mountains, casting golden light across the clearing, James smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. The battle was over, and he had won.